You are all very welcome to this first presentation, which is an introduction to Impressionism. What we'll be covering today is a social change in 19th century France, the Academy and the Salon exhibition, the Barbizon School, which is the plein air painters, Realism, we look at Édouard Manet, the Salon des Refusés, the Café Guerbois, and then the beginnings of Impressionism. So Impressionism is the beginning of what is called modern art. It's a new style of painting that was developed in late 19th century Paris in France. So this was around the 1860s to the 1870s. In France, during this period of the 19th century, there was significant social change happening, which did contribute to the movement. And we'll go through this in the next couple of slides. And Impressionism was also influenced by Realism and the Barbizon School of painting, which you have already looked at in September. So the Industrial Revolution in France began in the 1760s, and it resulted in expanded urban populations, rapid transport by rail, an increased scientific knowledge, and it also, most importantly, brought wealth to the middle classes. They grew rich and powerful, and they could afford luxuries such as artwork. However, it did create distinct disparities between social classes. So in one instance, it created wealth in the middle classes, but on the other scale, it created a social class that had poor working and living conditions. On the political side of things, a series of revolutions had happened in France which overthrew the monarchy. During this period of the late 19th century, France had been declared a republic after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, which started in 1870 and lasted to 1871. And the Second Empire of Louis Napoleon had disappeared virtually overnight after this. So it may have been these enormous social changes that dictated the great changes in French art. However, society remained fearful and distrusting of radical changes in France, and it is important to note that. So now we will look at the Academy and the Salon, and you will already have looked at this when you did Realism. So the government controlled the Academy, and it trained students to a rigid standard of artistic taste and style. To become a member of the Academy as an artist, you had to have an admission piece accepted to the Salon, which is in this picture here in the Louvre. So the jury system selected who would be accepted into the Salon's exhibition. And the jury itself was made up of very carefully selected artists and important officials. They wanted to uphold this rigid art style in the Academy. And the subjects of the paintings were generally historical, moral, or religious content. They had exotic fruits and flowers in them, pets, children, and elegant ladies. So now we will look at the Barbizon School. So the Barbizon School was a group of artists who worked near the village of Barbizon in France. They heavily influenced Impressionists. They painted out of doors en plein air, and they rejected the Academy and the Salon's styles. They didn't like the classical landscape style, and they wanted to study directly from nature. So they painted out of doors en plein air, and through this, they learned to appreciate the subtlety of nature and work directly onto a canvas out of doors, or en plein air. They moved away from the traditional art, which had historical or mythological content. So you can see here Ville d'Avray by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. Their paintings had certain romantic overtones, gloom and melancholy, but this is probably because their paintings were finished in an art studio where the painter added meaning or emotion to them. So the term realism has different meanings in different contexts. But in 19th century France, it refers to a group of artists who rejected the mythological, historical, and religious subject matter of the Academy in favour of scenes of everyday life. They focused on unidealised landscapes and scenes of peasant life. The aim of the Realists was to shock society out of its complacency and protest against the accepted conventions of academic art. So notable artists in this Realist period was Gustave Courbet and Jean-François Millet. And you can see his painting here of the Gleaners. And you can see here in Jean-François Millet's The Gleaners, which is from 1857. It depicts a realistic portrayal of modern life, which is what the Realists did. And their paintings often included farmers and peasants in scenes of everyday life or rural hardship or poverty. And you can see this in The Gleaners by Jean-François Millet, where they're picking corn. And their hands are even bleeding. And Édouard Manet, who started the Impressionist movement, was heavily influenced by realism. So now we look at Édouard Manet, who is one of the most influential artists of this period. He was influenced by realism, and Manet came from a well-off background, an upper-class background. He also trained in the Academy for 6 years in the traditional painting techniques. His whole life ambition and goal was to achieve respect and success from his paintings. However, this didn't happen. Manet found the conventional style of painting, which he had been trained in, stale and meaningless and slightly false. So he turned towards realism. So again, as I said, he was influenced heavily by realism. So his paintings reflected this. Then, of course, this caused an outcry amongst conservative painters of the Academy and the Salon. Year after year, his work was rejected by the jurists in the Salon. So his friends, so Édouard Manet's friends in Paris, they urged him to break away from the traditions of the Academy and exhibit with them. But Manet saw success in achieving his goals with the Salon. So now we will look at Salon de Refusés, which happened in 1863. So Manet submitted to the Salon in 1863. All 3 of his paintings were rejected. The jurists did not like Manet's use of colour, and in fact, so many were rejected from the Salon that year, over half of the paintings, that Napoleon III intervened and set up a special exhibition for the rejected paintings. And this was known as Salon de Refusés, and it's French for the refused. So Napoleon felt that the public should see and judge the artwork for themselves. However, people came to laugh and jeer at the artwork that had been rejected by the traditional style. They jeered most at Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is Édouard Manet painting here with the big X through it. And you already have notes on this from your realism. And I'll just stress that the original painting does not have a big X through it. And to go back through your notes from Manet and Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which you did get, to have a look at why this painting caused such an outcry amongst scholars and journalists and the general public. So in France in the 19th century, it was very common to go to a café. So here we look at Café Guerbois. So artists came together at Café Guerbois to discuss art and air their opinions about art in the society they were living in. So Édouard Manet did mix in these artistic circles that gathered in the cafes in Paris. He discussed art with the younger painters, and they looked up to him as a pioneer against the Academy's traditional art. So Manet did refuse to be associated with their group, but was heavily influenced by their innovations in paintings. And it is important to note that the Impressionists were not any kind of radical revolutionaries, but they were just merely a group of friends who had been working together and had established a style of painting. So now we will look at the very start of Impressionism. So in 1874, a group of artists in Paris took a very unusual step, which was they organised their own exhibition. And this was outside of the Salon and the Academy of Art. And this is where they got their name. So the name Impressionist came from this exhibition. One of Claude Monet's paintings was called Impressionism Sunrise. And in a review of this first exhibition, a journalist, Louis Leroy, described their work as an impression of nature, nothing more. So this exhibition that they had held themselves was an absolute failure. Instead of success, the artists were ridiculed by the public and journalists. People came not to see their artwork, but to laugh at what they considered was a bad joke. Claude Monet was the leader of the Impressionist group and the driving force behind the new style. Rejecting the Salon, so 30 artists or so exhibited in this first Impressionist exhibition. And some went on to become famous artists. This lesson was an introduction to Impressionism. It covered the social change in 19th century France, the Academy and the Salon exhibition, the Barbizon School, which was the en plein air painters, Realism and how it influenced Édouard Manet, the Salon de Refusés, Café Guerbois, where the artists met together to discuss controversial ideas about art, and then the beginnings of Impressionism, which was where the Impressionist artists came together and had their own exhibition against the traditional art. The next lesson will go into more of the artists themselves and the characteristics of Impressionism.